Let every day be Christmas. Christmas is forever, not just for one day. For loving, sharing, giving are not to put away.
Show you guys in my tree.
Like bells and lights and tinsel in some box upon a shelf. The good you do for others is good you do yourself. Times are quite different and you may not be near, but you're consciously connected to those you hold dear. So spread the love and share in the cheer. In December, sign 3 up to Gravity and enjoy rewards all year.
All right, so hello and welcome. So it's another episode of the Bitstocks podcast, and we have Kurt. I've always wondered, actually, the adequate way to pronounce your surname.
It depends who you ask. We have German family, which would say it is pronounced Wuckert, but I'm very much an American. I was born and raised in Chicago, so it's Wuckert.
Well, there's no huge introduction needed, really. Everyone in the BSV space is not just aware of who you are, actually very reliant on your reasoning, your understanding in this space, and the discernment that you use in order to articulate this noisy arena that we always continuously seem to find ourselves in. And this is why it's so important that we do have clear, good voices of reason. So truth is what attracted you to this, right? And being able to have a system where we can, to a degree, ensure and validate truth. Mm-hmm. Now, how have you seen the space develop over, say, the last 7 years, 8 years that you've been involved, right? And we've got into this really under the same principle around about truth, around about transparency. And even if you wanted to take the whole narrative of being, okay, banks are doing some unscrupulous things and we've got a way of holding them accountable, and so have our governments, etc. In terms of the experience now stepping into this space, how has those two things worked towards each other or pulled against each other for you in your experience?
I think it's become deeply political. I often call it the Bitcoin Civil War, and it's very much an information war. And they've adopted, and when I say they, I mean the small blockers. The small block narrative took over using aggressive, quite frankly, communist propaganda practices, divide and conquer, and they separated Bitcoiners from each other. They made us all cease to trust each other. And now we have, 3 competing chains, and the biggest one is the least valuable fundamentally, and they control it. And they've controlled it through a very, very aggressive social narrative, which is, I call it Bolshevik. I call it the Raspberry Revolution. It has all kinds of twinges of radical left-wing politics, as much as they consider themselves, these libertarian separatist types. It's socialist, and Craig is very right to call them socialist as well, because they've taken a socialist cultural narrative and they have transplanted it onto controlling BTC, their version of Bitcoin. And unfortunately,
how high do you think it goes, though?
That's a good question. I'm really not sure. I think there is a sort of insider's cabal. I do think there's some groups of people. I don't think they're particularly well coordinated, but I think there's a few silos of people who think they're in control of Bitcoin, and they're certainly acting like it.
So if we run with that, and if there is a group, which I agree with, I definitely believe this is controlled. I think it's very well orchestrated. Why? Right? Why is there this group, and why have they tried to steer the narrative to this radical world of anti-bank, anti-government? We all create our own little island. Code is law. Why? Why has this narrative been seeded into this community? Because from the one side, I can really genuinely say, okay, there is a good degree of ignorance, and people are outsourcing their own due diligence, and they're thinking, to people on Twitter, social media, etc., and not doing their own due diligence. And there's definitely a degree of that, right? But in terms of the more malicious aspects as to what's seeding it in the first place, and we think about what the promise of this technology is, what do you reckon is going on there?
I do agree that there's a large number of fools. There are just people that believe the narrative because they're supposed to, and that's every political movement, right? But when it comes down to the why, I think it's a straight up coup d'état for power. There's so much power in controlling a narrative and controlling people by steering information. And we've seen similar things. I've often made an analogy back to the Reformation. So this is 1500s Europe, right? Most people could not read Latin. So they needed words written, specifically the Bible, actually, but they needed lots of things or everything to be written in their own language. Otherwise, it was just up to the local government, which was typically the church at the time, to say, hey, here's the news of the day, and here's where you need to tithe. And by the way, your grandparents are in purgatory unless you pay us money. And that's a very convenient thing for the people in power to control information. And it was liberated not by all the revolutions and things that were going on. It was actually liberated by a simple technology, and that was the printing press. So Johann Gutenberg gave a simple tool to the world that brought down the cost of disseminating information by 90+%. And within a generation, there was massive fracture. The Catholic Church lost its hold on absolute power. And then over just a couple of generations, we saw the kings of Europe sort of, now they're just figureheads, and now there's democratic republics and stuff all over Europe. And it's been separated out away from these giant empire systems. And I think Bitcoin is much the same way. That's the same threat. So if you look at the people who are the kings today, they need to stop Bitcoin from more easily disseminating information, because then they lose even more power, frankly. So I think
by kings,
there's some relation to the same people.
Those who control the banking system and the cozy relationship with government. Is that what you're referring to as the kings? Or are you talking about people within the crypto community who are the larger companies that are larger, say, influencers in the space?
I think it's a bit of both, actually. If you look at who is in control of the crypto narrative, I mean, you can even look at a guy like Peter McCormick, for example. He just seems like he's a down home boy from, he's got a kitschy accent and all this stuff, but he's funded by Kraken. And I mean, listen to his list of people who he thanks at the beginning of his podcast.
Somebody who I trust, who knew him growing up, wasn't the smartest cookie. So he's bewildered as to how he's even managed to build this influence, because was not the smartest cookie. So he's confused.
Right.
He's like, I just don't understand what's going on and how he's even in this position of power, and why the hell people are even listening to this guy. Right?
For sure.
Which supports what you were just saying there.
Well, right. So he has various venture capital interests who created a character and propped him up, and he's the everyman's Bitcoin narrative. And hey, I understand this guy. I can relate with this guy. He's a simple character like me. I need to buy BTC and be rich like Peter. And it's a completely false narrative. It's much like the Obama narrative. He wasn't a down home boy from Chicago or Hawaii or wherever he's from either. He was created by much more powerful people to look like the average man and to relate with him, but ultimately get people to accept whatever ridiculous narrative they were pushing, because it consolidates their power and ultimately makes wealth more easy for them to control and steer their direction. And I really genuinely think that's what's going on.
If we break down the agenda as to why, right? So I completely agree in terms of, okay, we can see this being a threat to our existence, but in terms of what they've done, and also we look at the moves of central banks, they've been speaking about creating their own blockchain. Since even before I incorporated Bitstocks, that was 2014. And I know the Bank of England's was working on it roughly at the same time, because they put a paper out in the same year that I incorporated the company. So all of the central banks have been looking at this very, very, very carefully. And if you really look at the moves like Blockstream, Lightning, the hash war, the forks, the splits, the Ethereum camp, smart contracts, code is law, if we look at all of these things and we say, okay, what's the agenda here? What's really going on? On the one hand, we can say, well, I will most certainly say, they're stagnating and they're stunting the true promise of this technology. That's definitely 1 billion% my view, right? Mm-hmm. But then if we look at what they're doing on the other side is they're clearly allowing a lot of this stuff to flourish. They didn't shut it down in other ways, which they could have, right? Mm-hmm. Fine, regulation will turn slowly, legal will turn slowly, but they could have accelerated those wheels if they wanted to,
sure.
Right? So they've kept it in a container, in my opinion, for 10 years, right? And they've allowed enough innovation and things to happen and flow. Why do you think they've done now? So what's the other part of the agenda? If we really start like dissecting the agenda, right? Because to me, it just looks like they've kicked the can further along down the road, right? For what? Why?
And money and power, just like every other thing. I think if you look at modern democracies or democratic republics like the United States, for example, we're told every day, we're free, we're free, we're free. Turn on any baseball game or a football game and you sing the national anthem and everybody's excited. But then when it comes down to it, we're taxed at every opportunity. We've got rampant police violence and so the narrative in the streets is very different than the narrative we're told to pitch. But it's funny because people, if it's not happening to them, if the violence and the oppression isn't happening directly to them, they just wake up in the morning and say, "Oh man, it's great to be a free American."
Summer of love, I think the governor called it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The Portland governor, right? Summer of love.
Yeah.
Until it came on her doorstep. Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing. I mean, we've got this, be your own bank, be free with Bitcoin, and you see the superlatives from the people on Twitter, the Pomplianos and all of them talking about it like it's somehow liberated them, and it hasn't, frankly. But what it does do, and what I think is the other side of that coin for the big venture firms and some of the criminals, is that since they own the exchanges and they are also bundled up into the Tether iFinex cabal as well, it gives them a really great money laundering tool.
Totally.
Totally.
That's the other part. That's the other part of the agenda.
it is. So it's a convenient way to offshore money. And then you can use Binance or Huobi. You can use their internal ledger, which is off-chain. And you can give noobs tainted coins. And then you can take clean Bitcoins or clean Tether, and you can exchange for clean fiat. And then you've just washed your money. And if you have international connections, that's relatively easy to do.
I'll tell you like my view, my opinion, and how I have seen this space like playing out and why I think they're doing certain things. Because if I try to play devil's advocate and place myself in their entitled, empowered shoes, I think, okay, this is a really cool technology, but it's also really worrying for us. But it's a cool technology, right? Mm-hmm. Let's not kill it. Let's let it have legs. But we have to make sure that we control it, right? Mm-hmm. In some way, shape, or form. Now, they've given us all of this time to play around while we go out and test the experiments, right? What's possible, what different variants, adaptations, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable. And all in the meantime, they've been working on their own private labs at the central banking level, looking at the technical experiment play out in a public domain, observing and thinking, one, we need to have engineers that we can poach from this public pool to build out the variants that we need. So let these guys get their experience, right? We need to see how they operate. And in the interim, a huge plus is if they operate how we think they probably will operate, Silk Road, big, huge tick, right? Oh, they've worked this bit out and they've now got money laundering, they've got drugs. We can now have a way of facilitating trafficking.
Yeah.
You don't think, okay, well, we can now use the public domain to shift a lot of money around for us. Just look at the Venezuelan president, what he's being pulled up for, right? And in order to then learn how to maintain the aspects of the monetary system that they need to work for them, which is the anonymity aspect, so they can run their black budget projects, etc., right?
Yep.
While holding us more accountable and knowing everything about us in a time and a world where Bitcoin was released in the mix of the crisis, just the beginning of the crisis, which we know is not correlated to just timing, right? But ultimately it was released then. And we had a moment of 7 years of 0% interest rates, right? Knowing that the only way that they're trying to get out of this is stimulus, and it'll create an asset bubble. And we're now, in my opinion, towards the peak of this inflation cycle and this crazy amount of stimulus that we're now introducing because of this year under the pandemic. And now they're all of a sudden speaking about cashless societies. They're speaking about negative interest rates, because where can you go? 2008 crisis, they had 5% to play with, right? Like, where do you go now? Now they're talking about negative. Well, if liquidity is a water bottle and you got to keep everything in the water bottle, okay, how do you prevent people doing a run on the banks? Because the only way you can protect yourself from a negative interest rate, you take your cash out of the bank, you plunk it underneath your mattress, and you're not being charged for having your money there. Right. But that's a run on the banks, and that will create issues. Could everyone go into holding and saving mode? That will create a deflation cycle. And then they will rectify it with a hyperinflation cycle. So if you're not going to go potentially negative, and observing the lay of the land over the last 10 years since the prior recession, Bitcoin and what we have taught them has ironically probably expedited their solution to what is coming. And America is already speaking about, if I'm not mistaken, going digital from the 1st of January, correct?
Right? Yeah, I mean, it's being discussed. I don't know that it'll actually happen, but it's being discussed publicly, which is a huge step. Yeah.
And I know Pelosi tried to get something in the bill prior. So I'm looking at all of these things, right? I think, okay, there's definitely a correlation here. And then if now I look at how horrific and horrid Craig's been treated, right? How he's been turned into the villain. And that also makes me question how high the agenda goes, right? To have, say, someone waiting to capture, say, the tax investigation and people waiting there, it's premeditated, right? So it's all of these things and all of these pieces, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, do you know what? We are so goddamn lucky and fortunate that we've actually managed to preserve BSV. I don't think people really realize how incredibly fortunate we are to get to this point, considering if we're right on this, what we're assuming here, what I'm assuming here, right? And I'm putting these connections together, right? If I'm even moderately right on some of the things it is that I'm saying, the fact that we've even got to this point, I think is incredible, and we should be really, really thankful for, right? And
absolutely.
I know you have become a great spokespiece for, say, the likes of CoinGeek, the article that you put out recently, and really trying to help, like, kind of put into a timeline and words as to how fortunate, and this is really what's going on. This is actually like Bitcoin.
Yeah.
How difficult has that been?
That's a good question. You know, for me, the truth is like a lion, right? You let it out and it's going to attack. It's going to do what it does. But it's funny because I always sort of figured, and this is me being naive, I guess, that people would be interested to learn the truth and you know, perhaps benefit from it. But when you realize how heavily invested people are in a false narrative, it is a little scary, actually. And you mentioned Craig and everything Craig's been through. And, you know, Craig has hinted that his family's been threatened and all kinds of other things. And we've seen some evidence that, you know, a number of people have lost their lives. In fact, one of the great influences on my reporting is Ian Grigg, who is not somebody that gets mentioned often for his writing. He's obviously a cryptographic ninja. He's you know, one of the OGs, but his writings about Satoshi are incredible. And he's written point blank, people have died for Bitcoin. And he's not kidding. He obviously knows. He's talking about specific people who he hasn't named, but he's one of the guys who knows. And it's a little bit scary. And I have to weigh out how I feel about Bitcoin and why I think it's an important mission versus, am I willing to be a martyr for Bitcoin here? And, so.
I'm 100% with you on this. And when I spoke at CoinGeek London, before the pandemic, when the world was simple.
For real.
I was very emotional. One, I just freestyled it. And the reason why I didn't want to go on a script is because of what we're discussing just here, right? I really thought about this stuff, and I sat there and I put myself in Craig's shoes, and I was like, the level of strength, right, that it would take to do the things that this guy has done and continue to do, it is even awkward to speak about the things that I assume must have been happening behind the scenes, right? Yeah. Because if you really understand geopolitics, you understand the world, you understand the way the world works, you understand the incentives, the agendas, the hidden powers, the shadows, you know how they operate, right? Mm-hmm. And when someone then pops on the scene and introduces a technology, a beacon of light, a tool of transparency and truth for humanity, how the other side responds and reacts. Like, we've got a plethora of examples that shows us how the other side responds and how they react. And the fact that Craig's come out of it the way that he has, intact as he had, I'm not talking about from a physical health standpoint, I'm talking about psychologically, right? I think is incredible, like absolutely incredible. That's where he's really, really, really not even getting remotely close to the credit as to what he's not doing from a business standpoint, genuinely what he's doing for humanity. Yeah.
I agree completely. And he wears it on his face. I mean, I've known of Craig for about 5 years now, and you can see it. I mean, he's a man of strength, but he's also he's a man of sorrows, and you can see the battle scars on his soul as he walks into the room, and he swallows it and gives, barn burning speeches and things, and it's great. But at the same time, it's clear that there's a lot of hurt there. It's clear that he's been through a lot that maybe he even perhaps regrets, because it's brought a lot of unnecessary harm to his family, and he's mentioned as much. He mentions it briefly, but he does mention it that I'm at some point, my family's going to pay some price for Bitcoin in the future, and all of this. He keeps hinting that some big truth is going to come out at some point, and there's going to be fallout that's unfortunately going to fall on him and his family's head. And it's a really difficult thing. And it's quite frankly, these are the words of a man who's been amid a war. It is a war that we're in, and we don't fight wars the way we did a generation or two ago. Our wars today are information wars, and they have very bizarre casualties. We snuff out people that tell too many truths, and we prop up people that make us feel good, but the people that make us feel good are often lying to us to keep us placated. And this is kind of a Matrix speech. It's like Morpheus telling Neo, it's not going to be hard, or it's not going to be easy, but it's going to be the truth. And that's
why I was excited to have a chat with you, because just from the outside in, it's the first time we've had a proper chat. And reading your content, reading your articles, and also the position you've been put into it's for a reason, right? Because you have the ability to articulate these things. And I was reading them, I was thinking, there's no way that Kurt's articulating this stuff this well with this much clarity without him probably knowing the other aspects or having at least ideas around the other aspects, but yet you still choose to do it. So like why have you taken that position, and why are you continuing to take that position? And what's the goal, right? Well, what do you want to see, and in what time frame?
A lot of people die a little bit every day. They wake up, they go to work, they put in their 8 hours plus 2 hours commute and whatever. They die of a heart attack 2 years after they retire, and that's their life. And it's tempting because it's easy, right? It's what everyone tells you to do. It's what all your friends tell you to do. And I've just never been able to accept that, hey, this is what life looks like. So even as a kid, I was always reading books like how do entrepreneurs think, or how did what influenced an explorer like Hernando de Soto, or why would somebody hop on a ship and just go? and those are the people that always inspired me. So I just kind of fell into being that guy. A little bit of it is frankly accidental, that I was just curious how the world worked. And there's an official version of how the world works. And then there's the people that leak information about, hey, actually, this guy got assassinated and that freed up a bunch of capital that got absorbed by, some princes or some bankers or whoever. And that's why Europe's shaped the way it is today. And, and that always fascinated me, because you don't learn that in history class, but there's histories of it. There's people's diaries who've been published, and there is an actual history of these things. That
history, and you have his story, right?
Precisely.
And you need to know which one it is that you're reading.
Yes. Well, and there's a lot of disinformation out there too. I as a kid, I used to listen to Art Bell and Alex Jones and some of these people that got real into the conspiracy theories, and I think there's some truth there, but I think a lot of it is.
This is where, like, Alex Jones is a great example, right? Because I've consumed a lot of Alex Jones content over the years, and I've always had a love-hate relationship with the guy, right?
Me too.
And what I find very dangerous about people like Alex Jones, and to a degree, I will put almost David Icke, not nowhere near totally in the vicinity of Alex Jones, but on the point that I'm going to make, I'll still put him in a similar category, okay?
Sure.
And that is, if you have the ability to understand the lay of the land and the tongue to articulate it, and you give a population 95% truth, the witchcraft is the 5%, right? That's where they spin, right? And that's how you armor people up, and you think that you've got in fact, your whole following thinks they're a bunch of light workers and people who are fighting a good fight and who are informed and woke, right? But unaware of that 5%, because even though they are on the right path from a moral standpoint, they believe, okay, they're still lazy in outsourcing all of their thinking to Alex and not going to 100%. Check out and doing their own due diligence, right? Yep. And you notice that a pattern with people like Alex, and even, and this is my bonnet with David Icke, they're not solution-based. They'll tell you every problem in the world, but they will not provide solutions.
Precisely. And, I say the same thing about all these documentaries. There's always a documentary every 3 or 4 months, something comes out. It's, oh my gosh, this big dilemma, the social dilemma. I watched it about a week ago, and it was the same thing. It's, no, these are all these problems. And when it comes to the solutions, right, the solutions are, hey, maybe we need a regulatory bureaucracy or something. And it's come on, it's so lazy. And again, from a good documentary, but there's no money in actually solving that problem, because actually solving that problem is a slog. It's hard work that nobody frankly wants to do, because there's so much more money in doing something else. And so I've taken that upon myself. Back to the Bitcoin conversation, I think it's important for somebody to just say these things, to mention, hey, Greg Maxwell is not just some computer programmer. He was a professional social engineer paid by the Tides Foundation to work for Wikimedia, which is a governing organization over Wikipedia. And he was so brazen that his own colleagues forced him out of the company, because even in the role that he was hired to do, which was to tailor information, he was found so toxic by the other people in the department. And thank God Wikipedia keeps logs of the moderators and admins, of all the people saying, God, he's running 12 accounts right now that are all debating with each other and trying to steer this narrative to make people think that there's a passionate debate about XYZ thing.
Imagine what it must be like in his head.
Ugh.
Like, dude, 12 accounts. 12 accounts. Like, just sitting there arguing with himself. Imagine the poor girlfriend, if he had one, which I doubt, right? Who's like, when he's in his mode with running his 12 accounts, she's sitting there, been ready for 2 hours for the date that he promised her the week prior, right? Oh, baby, are we ready yet? Are we going to go yet? And he's just there out at it, 12 accounts. Yeah. How can anyone even have the mental headspace to do something like that?
It's sick, frankly. And that's the real
And that's
problem is
because it's so sick and it's so weird that your average individual just won't even comprehend that someone's doing that. Like, why would this guy have 12 accounts arguing with himself all day?
It's crazy. But it's not uncommon. It's something that's been done in corporate espionage for generations. Like, look at how the big banks, for a great example, why did Rothschild end up owning most of the London Stock Exchange? Well, it was the way they spun information during the French Revolution. They were able to tell people that the Battle of Waterloo went one way but not another, crash the market and buy it at pennies on the dollar, and then there you go. So it's the exact same thing. It's sock puppetry. Oh no, the rider has showed up, and it's this romantic thing. You picture this guy coming from Waterloo. We've lost. Napoleon's coming, but batten down the hatches, and it's just a lie. But it's the exact same thing that we see in today's media, and it's very clearly being done in the Bitcoin channels as well. We see it on Bitcoin Talk and Reddit, and Craig has been very clear about that too, that the moderators stole the logs from Bitcoin.org. They pasted them at Bitcoin Talk, where Satoshi was no longer a moderator and they were able to just start quoting Satoshi out of context and deleting anybody that called them out on it. And so then they create 8-9 years now of context about Satoshi being whatever they want him to be. And then, Thamos and all of the other moderators over there just telling him, oh, you big blockers are all...
That's a name I've not heard in a while, Thamos.
Yeah. And that's, you see it all happen. And if you're aware of how social engineering works, it's very, very clear. But, people aren't educated in such things. People are taught to obey. Public schools and things are, but listen to the teacher. Your teacher is in charge, and just listen to them. And I don't know how you break that. It has
changed the narrative. I like to, for most of my time, and a fun activity, I like to kick it in observer mode, right? I like to sit and I like to observe. And in observation of how our space is developed, by our space I'm talking about from Bitcoin Cash to present with BitcoinSV, and with Craig's involvement from the Bitcoin Cash day to now it being obviously directed around BitcoinSV. And in the Bitcoin Cash days, the narrative was very strong on digital cash. Mm-hmm. I mean, from Craig, from Jimmy, from the camp, it was digital cash, digital cash, digital cash. Digital cash and those merchants, right? These were like the big things. And it was around utilizing this as a mechanism of payment. That was like the real strong push. And I couldn't help but notice over the months and then years that narrative, even from Craig and Jimmy, etc., started to change, started to move away from it being digital cash. And there start to be a very strong push towards regulatory clarity and legal clarity and education around law, which has been great if people are listening to what is actually being said and how certain projects fit within scope and why other projects fit, pretty much everything fits outside of scope. But what I found interesting is that it seemed to me that there must be conversations happening at a higher level, which are trickling down and also shaping the narrative within this community as to the best way forward, right? Which is, I can imagine, a natural process. Now, in terms of like where we are present and the things that you've seen over the years, what would you say is 2 things that you really like about where we are right now, and a couple things that still remain that we need to get better on?
I think it's a good question. So two things that I really like. First of all, I think the biggest one is a focus on business. I've been saying for probably 4 or 5 years now that business actually always wins eventually. Like all these other things, scientists, and you look at projects like Cardano or even Ethereum, they're all computer scientists. These are These are projects for nerds to play and create genuinely fun things often enough, but there's no business acumen there. So they never become more than hey, look what I made this thing do. And I think the business slant of BSV is exactly what Bitcoin should have been since day one. Like, hey, this solves payment friction problems. This solves data integrity problems. This solves, which then extrapolates out to chain of custody and Internet of Things and all of that. So to start with a business posture, I think is the single best thing. So I don't know if that's two things or one thing, but I think
I'll take it as one. Business.
All right, that's good. Okay, so then I think the payment aspect of it has been minimized to a degree, but I don't think it's been washed away. I actually spent 3 days with the guys from AnyPay in New York about 2 weeks ago at CoinGeek, and they're super excited about payments. They have a really good point of sale system. And they're investing in it heavily. They're building out.
That looks quite exciting.
Yeah, they're fantastic. And there's other people playing in that realm too. But I think transitioning away from this sort of Roger Ver, like, hey, I just bought a hot dog, and that's like is probably not.
This vending machine accepts Bitcoin Cash.
Right. It's fun. It's something that's fun to see, but that's not the thing that's going to change the world. And I think we've tried to change the world that way for 10 years. And it's fair to see that it's not the thing that people are going to get excited about first. So it's probably not the foundational thing that's going to make Bitcoin grow. So I like the flexibility and posture that we've seen from Craig and Jimmy to say, hey, you know what? I don't feel like going to local grocery stores and stuff and trying to set them up with payment terminals, because it's too many leaps to get people to think that way. So I think changing the posture a bit and saying, okay, let's talk about data integrity and business services from a data integrity standpoint, I think is probably a wise shift in narrative to attempt, at the very least, just a key differentiator for BSV away from the other Bitcoin chains. But it also helps show that things like Ethereum are unnecessary, and they always were. So I think that that flexibility in narrative and then the focus on business are my two things that I'm excited about. If there were two things that I think we could do better,
this part is where everyone's going to lean in now. Like, okay. So.
I don't know that anybody will be shocked, because these are pain points that we're all experiencing. Wallets. We have a number of good wallets, and they do a few things very well, but they're all very limited. They're very limited in scope. I think we've seen some talk of, hey, we're going to add other features, we're going to add tokenization, and they just kind of haven't happened yet.
Is that the main thing you'd like to see of wallets, is tokenization? So different assets on BSV being handled in the wallet?
I would, but here's why I think they haven't happened. I think when people think of tokens, it's just going to be like, hey, make Kirk coin and maybe it goes up in value. And then, that's kind of the only thing to do with tokens right now, until you sign some kind of business agreement that you're going to tokenize some actual asset for tracking or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to have, first of all, better wallets, more open wallets that people can play with and reprogram. And we have some killer code ninjas in this community. And they all kind of talk about like, I'm just going to code up a wallet that does everything I want. We haven't seen it yet. We need that. But then the other thing is, I think we could use a little more of a go fast and break stuff attitude. I think we've gone a little too far in the direction of regulatory compliance and law and everything else, which I think are good things.
Completely agree. But
we need more people to say, you know what, I'm going to stay up till 4 a.m. and I am going to I'm going to make something that maybe is kind of a gray market thing, but I'm just going to do it anyways. Because and I'd like to point out that that's actually one of the big things that I respect about Calvin, is that he did this with the gambling industry a decade or two ago. Like, the internet's kind of a crazy place, and I understand gambling and software, and I'm going to make a casino, and maybe some laws get broken and maybe they don't. I'll pay a fine, but we'll all be better for it. And then at the end of, I believe he was on the FBI's most wanted list for something for a while. But at the end of that road, he's a regulatory consultant on how to do this stuff right. And it was because he was brave enough to go fast, break stuff, risk his own skin a little bit.
Completely agree on that. Completely, utterly agree on that. And I think it creates a bit of fear in the SV camp, to be honest, because there has been such a very strongly delivered message about law and where your projects fit underneath law, which the law actually at present hasn't caught up to what we're speaking on. We see it's happening, and it's great that it's happening. It's amazing that it's happening, right? But I do think that we run the risk of being too cautious, and it's just stunting innovation. And with what you just said, and I completely agree with what you said on Calvin as well, and I hope he brings a lot of that to the camp here. But at the same time, he is very strong on the legal enforcement side and carrying that message forward as well, which I don't disagree with either. Now, how do you put ICOs in the mix of what you just said?
I think it fits right in. Conceptually, it's crowdfunding, right? I don't think there's anything innately good or bad about crowdfunding. I think it's a technological innovation, and it's great. However, what we've seen is 90+% exit scams with people who raise $5 million in Ethereum and then their project disappears the next day.
But what we did see is new ways of going about raising capital for entrepreneurs. We screwed up the execution. We totally screwed the execution, right? Yeah. But the fact that it happened, I genuinely feel we're better for it. Because now we're speaking about STOs, right? Yeah. And do it in a proper way, legally, lawfully compliant, etc. And we need to do and go through these cycles. And what your position is as you go through these cycles is obviously dependent on the risk appetite of the entrepreneur and the business that's operating within the field. Like, would I go out and do what Arthur Hayes done? Again, like his business started pretty much the same time that my business did. I thought what he was doing was like ahead of the curve, really interesting. And also I was like, no chance in hell that I want to follow that template. Right? Like, dude, have your billion, but toilet paper still toilet paper in prison, right? So that's the only paper you're going to be playing. That's the only paper you'll be playing around with in prison. So it's that, again, you weigh it up. But am I glad that we had the ICO movement? To be honest with you, yeah, I didn't get involved in it in any heavy way, but I'm glad that we had it because it laid down a precedent and it showed the world really that there's more interesting ways and there's different ways. And now we can really truly think outside the box when it comes to the subject of funding new ideas. But at the same time, we massively took the piss, right? As a space.
We showed how irresponsible we are as a culture, and then that invites more regulatory pressure, and then that stifles innovation. And I always tell people, I'm an advocate for absolute human sovereignty, self-government, but you need to be worthy to self-govern. You need to prove that you can govern yourself, or else you will be governed. And I think that's a lot where we're at today, is we've shown immaturity with the technologies that we've developed and been given. And now we're looking at, I think the BSV narrative is a bit of a backlash to that. And I think it's fair to say, like, hey, a good number of these people should be in prison. They deliberately bastardized the technology to raise money and for themselves. They were just liars. It was simple pump and dump Ponzi schemes and exit scams. And it's unfortunate. But again, like you said, it's great technology. We should be able to raise capital in a way that is not so siloed. And that's it's a balancing act. And I don't know how it plays out over the next few years.
So speaking about next few years, how do you see this space in 2 years, 5 years, and 10? The world, because of this space and the space within it, how do you see it over that time, those 3 time horizons?
So 2 years, I would really like to see just good growth, actual business. We've seen a lot of upfront investment from a lot of the venture capital people on the BSV side. And the key differentiator there is venture capital and all other chains are buying coins to hold, hoping they go up and absorb other value. But the venture capital in the BSV space is taking their money and they are investing in businesses that can benefit from the unique properties of BSV. So I would like to see some of those really start to play out. And I think 2 years is probably a reasonable time frame for some of these big IoT projects and chain of custody things. I'd like to see Seafood Chain by Unisat, for example, actually have, hey, there are supply chains using the product. And I think that will sort of inform the next set. So then looking out at 5 years, we could be looking at a very different world. I'm frankly a little concerned about how the sort of pandemic and hyperinflation and all of that plays out. If some of the things we were talking about earlier play out, we could be looking at Bitcoin valuations that are in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars valuation. And those of us who have the Bitcoin are living in communities that are protected from the people who didn't. And that could be a very scary thing, actually.
So by that, are you talking about BSV still?
I am. I don't think the investment thesis of BTC as the store of value makes sense long term. I think it'll continue to play out. There will also be a halvening in between that 2 and 5 year period, where BTC again should lose more profitability to mine unless the fee situation. At some point, there's a crossover.
But do you see BTC surviving to the next halvening at these type of price, basically a price point higher than SV? And if it starts losing ground to SV in an accelerated way, the viability of the project as a whole, do you see it surviving?
I think anything's possible. I think bad economic policies can go on for a long time. I was born in 1986, but had I been born in the 50s, I would have been
I'm 87. Got 1 year on me.
Cool. Had I been born in the 50s and been in my 20s when we got off the gold standard, I would have said, in a decade that the dollar is going to collapse. Well, 50 years later, there's still a dollar. It has certainly lost purchasing power, but yeah, when you can play monkey games with people, you can continue to keep things going on fumes for a very long time. So I don't want to make any grandiose predictions about the collapse of BTC, but what I do know is that long term, its economics are unviable, just like the US dollars. I would like to see Tether collapse. I'd like to see that whole cabal kind of use their shorts because they've just
I have no idea how they've managed to do what they've done. And that's, again, for me, was a great pillar in the argument of this goes very high. If I started Tether, it would have got shut down years ago and I would be in jail. Yep. Easily. If I started that thing, it would have been shut down and I will be in jail. I know that 1,000,000,000%. How they've managed to keep that going for so long, with all the question marks all around it, to me just screams this goes to the top. Like, this goes real high. This goes very, 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 very high to keep that rocking and rolling.
Does. It sure does. And actually, a minor segue. We've seen some of this. The corruption with Bruce Reinhart, who was one of the judges in the Wright case, and his personal connections to Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein, who has heavy investment connections to Bitcoin Core. He was laundering money through a venture capital firm in Japan called Digital Garage, and they were sending that money to MIT to pay Bitcoin Core developers to do something. So we have very close business and finance connections to some of these people that, again, are judges.
We're talking about deep state. Like, we're talking about direct connections to what is now being called and coined the deep state, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we know that the 9/11 report had been redacted for all of the Saudi Arabia connections. And we know a very simple history will show that the Bin Ladens and the Bushes are actually business partners. We're talking the parents. So the generation prior, George W. would have been on family vacations with the Bin Ladens as a boy. And just stating that, there are people who will watch this video and say, "Oh, here we go. Here's the conspiracy theory." I don't know what that means, but I do know who I went on vacation with as a child, and I think it'd be very bizarre to be at war with them in 20 years.
Yes.
So
yes.
It's complicated. Like, we also know that Osama bin Laden specifically was a CIA asset in Afghanistan for a decade or so before all of a sudden he became persona non grata. And it's very interesting how power structures can shift like that. And I think it's important to look at the same thing with Bitcoin and say, okay, who did I used to go to conferences with? Who was I at conferences with 3 or 4 years ago? Because a lot of those people would view me as an enemy today. And we were very happy to have beers in 2014 or 15. And now I get them, calling me a paid shill and a scammer and all of this stuff across Twitter. And it's like, first of all, you and I we were maybe not friends, but we were friendly and we agreed on worldview and politics and all these different things. And now I'm this enemy because I believe in the big block version of Bitcoin and you're a small blocker. And that's a very weird thing. And I don't know where that comes from, because it's not my personal reaction to things. Like, if somebody disagrees, I like to disagree well, and I like to learn why we may disagree, and maybe I'll learn something.
Exactly.
But most people are very reactionary, and they assume there's a puppet master pulling my strings if I suddenly disagree with them, and that's bizarre. But I understand why some of these things become crazy. But that's why, looking at the 5 and 10 year scope of Bitcoin, we could see massive polar shift in not just the Bitcoin wars, but also in the entire global economy, because we don't know what happens with these deep state characters. We don't know how much power the CIA has over, I mean, anything. Maybe the CIA is controlling the mining interests of BTC right now. We don't know. We do know that the CIA does pull those kinds of strings, that they have to make up their own budgets and they have to make decisions on the fly out in the field because their budgets are secret. So they literally need to engage in human trafficking and drug trade and weapons, just to fund their own operations. And so that creates very, very weird incentives and a lot of very crazy stories that you end up reading books about 20 years after these things happened. And, you read about Operation Northwoods or some of these other things and just
dude, that Operation Paperclip.
Right. And it's funny to think that, okay, there were all of the Nazi officers were in Ohio for 20 years and basically built NASA and the entire face of what the Air Force became. And it's like, that's bonkers. That's completely crazy stuff. And if I was the guy saying it in the 50s, I would have been the crazy guy. And now it's just like, Werner von Braun, sure, bring him in. Like, it's just like, it's crazy how little we talk about these things in hindsight. And I think the Bitcoin civil war and all of that will end up being much the same. And in a decade, we'll look back and say, holy cow, there was some wild, wild stuff going on that some people knew, some people were screaming about and pointing out. Maybe I'll be one of those guys in 10 years that has, the BBC asking, how did you know?
My eyes were just open. That's it. I can see.
Yeah, I thought it was obvious. So, yeah.
Okay, so I don't know. What does it look like for everyone else, right? So outside of the context of us operating within this space, your person on the street, right? What would you like it to look like for them? The fact that we're working on this, we're trying to keep this pure. We're trying to amplify and pump out the signal to the world that they need to pay attention to this technology. Let's say the world agrees with us, right? And and we start getting a lot more traction over the next couple of years. We're starting to really integrate within the next 5 years, and leading to the 10-year point, we're playing now. Like we're in it. Like we're building cool stuff. We've got infrastructure on top of it. We've got supply chains going. You've got people like Elon Musk plowing forward, doing the things that is plowing forward. What does the world look like because of Bitcoin? Just what you'd like it to look like in 10 years.
Man, I really hope we're more free. I think if things work out the way that I think they'll work out, people will own their own wealth. They'll own their own data. And, people say these things like a stupid slogan, but they really matter. And I think today most people don't understand why they matter. They understand that they don't like when Facebook is advertising to them about the things they were talking about 20 minutes earlier with their iPhone in their pocket. And like, I'm being monitored. Like I can very clearly see in my life that I'm being monitored. I would like to see people talk about those things as if they're in the past, because they are. I want people to say, hey, remember when the surveillance economy and all of that was a big thing and we didn't know what our government was actually up to and there was all this stuff? Because Bitcoin really is it's a giant surveillance network also. Like it's one of the other things. And if it holds the government more accountable and the big businesses and the banks and all of these things more accountable, I'm not a criminal. I don't care that much whether I'm being monitored because I'm not up to anything. And I do want to own my privacy. I don't want people monitoring me absurdly, but this sort of open economy, the idea that everything is on a public blockchain that can be audited and looked into and perhaps, get rid of so much inefficiency that taxes are then lowered and our wealth has increased because of sound money. I mean, we could be talking about a massive shift in everything from individual sovereignty to the ownership of property and to really know that you own your things because this was hashed properly. I don't have to go to the assessor's office and make sure that my title on my car was notarized properly and that somebody can't, rip it out from under, like tow my car out of my driveway because some notary didn't sign something right and file the right paperwork and all that kind of thing. To say that, hey, these things are definitely mine and I can prove it instantly. And so we don't need to go to court and we don't need to be stuck in hock and I don't need to file bankruptcy because some idiot did the paperwork wrong. And
yeah.
That's all of those things, all of those efficiencies should allow us to focus on the things that we love. And for me, that's my family. That's the martial arts. I love
jiu-jitsu, right?
I'm a Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach. Yeah, I've been a practitioner for about 10 years now.
Awesome. Do you reckon that helps you? Because I know the discipline aspect. So for me, growing up, it was Shotokan karate.
Sure.
So I was like a student of that. And I think anyone who's gone through a decent spout of being a martial artist, unless you're just insanely aggressive and you're doing it to beat people up, which is not really what you should be there for, tend to bring that discipline to other aspects of their life.
It's definitely taught me how to take a furious beating and remain calm through it.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest benefit of the martial arts is to realize exactly how tough I am, but weighted against how tough I'm not. And I think it's very crucial to know yourself and to know your own weaknesses. And most people have no idea. So they don't know how to grapple with those things and they're controlled by their ego. Whereas I've probably spent 10,000 hours with, a sweaty person sitting on my face and trying to break my shoulder or, whatever else. And just saying,
we're still talking about karate, right?
Yes.
It could have been like the last CoinDesk conference in New York in the BTC core camp.
Well, that's the thing. Like jiu-jitsu is a grappling art. So it's very much like wrestling. So to beat somebody often starts with a lot of like, a smothering against your will. So it very much has a like, oh my goodness, I am panicking while being crushed right now. But that teaches you a lot of things. It took me years to get comfortable with, if I can survive this person's onslaught, I can solve the problem mentally, translate it physically, and I can win this match. And that's something that almost nobody has experience with because we don't fight recreationally anymore.
That's a life skill. You could apply that to every scenario in your life. That's a life skill.
Yes. So that's something that I hope all of the other problems get solved and I can spend more time on the gym, more time with my wife and son. We have a new baby on the way in April. We're very excited about.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. And, that's what I want to worry about. I don't want to worry about the deep state or Greg Maxwell or any of these things. Is the dollar going to collapse? Is my bank going to seize my funds? Is the IRS going to kick my door in because I'm a Bitcoiner? And all these different things. I would like the knowledge and understanding and the safety that comes with understanding these things, that what we're advocating for is a more peaceful world and a more efficient world and a place where we are more free because we own ourselves and we own everything that goes with that.
It's beautiful, brother. I couldn't agree more. So from a process of hyper efficiency, achieving sovereignty and freedom to allow human beings to be more of what we are and focus on being creative human beings experiencing a human experience. Kurt, my brother, thank you so much. I don't know why we wait so long to have a proper conversation. We should definitely hash it out more. What's the best way for people to contact you, Kurt?
All over the place. I'm at Kurt Wuckert JR basically everywhere. So Telegram, Keybase. You can hit me up on Twitch at user292. You can DM me on Twitter, whatever. But I'm easy to track down. I'm basically public every day. So feel free to shout out, ask me questions. I like to communicate with people.
Wicked. Kurt, it's been a pleasure, brother. Thank you for joining the podcast, and we will speak soon. To everyone, thank you for tuning in again. Peace, love, and light. All the best.